Robin.
I'm Robin Gouchelet. I work with Penny Associates and consult for Jewel Labs. And I'm also delighted to be here in person and see all your faces.
Has everyone had a chance to look at the four quite astounding video presentations that we've got? No? Good. All right. I thought they were really good myself. Got some very interesting material, which is going to take us into the whole kind of politics of the science here. You know, why is there so much misleading science? Why are conflicts of interest playing such a significant role? What's going on with the ultimate aims of all this? And are people kind of being directed to particular outcomes and the science bending around that? Are there entire major research institutions that have built-in but undisclosed biases? I think they are. So we've got some excellent presenters and excellent panelists. I'd like you here in the audience, live in person in Liverpool, to make a big contribution to this session by asking totally awesome questions. And also, we're going to have Robin is going to help me sort of curate the questions into interesting themes. Also, everybody watching from afar, wherever you are, in whatever corner of the world, we want your totally awesome questions, please. Don't be afraid to put challenging questions to these guys, even if you don't necessarily agree with the premise of the question. We'll get more out of the session if we have challenging questions to the audience. What you say in response to people who say that nicotine's addictive and you're promoting an epidemic of addiction? Don't be afraid to put the questions that are put to you to the expert panel that we have here. Okay. I'm going to start actually just by putting a question that is essentially a follow-up from each of the presentations that I've watched. Michelle, just tell us what we can learn about the way science played out with the war on drugs, going right back through the past century and you know, the past 100 years or so. What do we find becomes the scientific preoccupation?
Well, first of all, I'm so excited to be here. Hello, everyone all around the world. And Clive, thank you. That's a great question. You know, starting at least as early as the discussion around opium smoking, the pattern seems to be that science, once it enters the conversation, it's usually the last, you know, it's the last girl to the party, so to speak. There's years and years of lead up to when science starts to get involved. And science and evidence are really only as good as the questions that are asked in the research. So, you know, when you're following into a conversation that's been going on for years about this horrible thing that's happening to society around a substance, the questions are often quite skewed and they're coming from a specific perspective. So that's what I see. I see people asking, you know, well, why is this so bad? Or how do we stop this? And there are many assumptions that go into that. And a lot of times the assumptions and the perspectives are determined and dictated by the popular conversation, which in turn is dictated by whatever the dominant culture is at the time. You know, the media plays on that because they want to get the most readers, so they play on whatever scares the dominant group the most. Often, you know, in the US, that traditionally means, and still to this day means, we're talking about suburban white middle class people. So the entire substance use conversation, when it becomes a public conversation, usually begins with this idea. It's framed around a suburban crisis. And so unfortunately, that means the drugs that become targets of drug war policies are the ones that scare white middle-class suburban parents the most.
Michelle, did you see any difference in the way that dominant group, that powerful group of interests in the United States approaches e-cigarettes versus how it approaches menthol cigarettes?
Yeah, I mean, the menthol cigarette thing, I mean, the middle class at this point, they aren't terribly concerned with smoking, which should be concerning because there are still huge rates. You know, the prevalence is still really high in certain groups like Indigenous Americans. And then if you look at around the world, you know, cigarettes, Kraytags, biddies, all these other combustible forms of tobacco are still causing massive amounts of death around the world. But in America, the middle class parents aren't terribly worried. Smoking has been coded as a non-white, non-middle class behavior at this point. It's portrayed as, you know, lower class or a problem of marginalized communities. e-cigarettes is the new scary thing, and specifically because it is targeting a group that was considered to be resolved when it comes to the issue of tobacco. E-cigarettes, the whole conversation has been framed around suburban, middle and upper middle class teenagers becoming addicts. And very scientific conversation around addiction itself is influenced by this whole dominant theory culture. You actually see two different definitions at certain points in the literature about what addiction actually is, and it is defined by willful hedonistic, someone who seeks pleasure, that type of addict, versus the innocent addict, which is someone who accidentally became addicted through, maybe they had chronic pain, and that almost always falls onto the drugs that are commonly used among white groups, upper and middle class groups, even lower white groups like methamphetamine. It's usually seen as tragic, they're victims, whereas the other stuff is coded as, you did it yourself, you are a perpetrator.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to come back to all those themes a bit later, but I'd just like to turn to Brad Rodu now. Brad, you made a pretty compelling case that this massive United States funding body, the National Institutes for Health, which comprises several agencies, has some built-in biases. Why do you think that? I mean, ostensibly, research and science is a neutral exploration of the natural and human world. Why do you see a kind of distortion in the way that it spends its money? And what makes you so sure of that? If you could just kind of give us your insights there.
Well, good morning, Clive, and good morning, the GFN audience. Well, first of all, research universities are nothing but businesses, and they're funded mainly by the federal government through NIH grants and contracts. If you think universities are here to teach students, well, you have another thing coming. It's mainly so that they can continue to function and grow. And they do so with federal grants and contracts, as I pointed out in my presentation. And despite the fact that there's $40 billion coming from NIH, it's not enough for all of the researchers and faculty in the giant medical industrial complex in the United States. So every institution, every researcher is competing for very scarce research money. And the way they compete is to produce the best and most spectacular results. And they employ a university's media research or media arms to basically propagate those findings. And it's a setup for continued funding and continued results. Now, when you're talking about tobacco, and I tried to point out how the federal government wants a tobacco-free society, that's a lead-in to only coming up with negative results. And so you can see the results of that in all of our media. So I think it's a setup, and I think it's very effective.
But Brad, what I find difficult about this is you could do good research, and you could do good research that showed that you could basically eliminate most of the disease associated with smoking-related disease. You could basically end the smoking epidemic. What I don't understand, and you get a Nobel Prize for that. There's no reason why you shouldn't get incredibly big plaudits for it. You're solving one of the biggest public health problems of all time. Why wouldn't that be something that you saw a lot more of in the agenda of NIH? And the NIH, it is a National Institute for Health after all. Why wouldn't they be totally thrilled by harm reduction research that shows that you can eliminate, nearly all of the risks associated with smoking? What's missing there? What's driving them in the other direction?
Well, thank you for that question, Clive. I am still holding out for the Nobel, by the way, but I'm
richly deserved and long overdue, I think, is the consensus here in Liverpool.
Yes, yes. No, but the thing is, the tone is set on top. And, as I tried to show in my presentation, in 1994, I suggested that smokeless tobacco might be a safer substitute for some cigarette smokers. And I was blasted for that by the National Cancer Institute, investigated for a year, and then it went on for 2 more years after that, where I just about lost my job. And that was all because I suggested something. So,
Brad, that's what happened, but why did that happen?
That's the tone that's set. And once that's set, not only can you not go up against that tone and that statement, but you can't even get any allies. People say, Brad, why hasn't faculty from all over medicine, all over the United States, why haven't they adopted tobacco harm reduction? This is the reason.
Okay,
funding
Brad.
Doesn't let them.
But who owns that tone? I mean, the National Institute of Health is full of actual human beings that decide what the tone is. Why is it that somebody decides that, research showing that smokeless tobacco is much less harmful than smoking is something to be demonized and cast out? Who is the guardian of that idea, and what stops them changing their mind?
There isn't a single guardian, Clive. I showed in my presentation, U of L, University of Louisville, has a small cut of all the research funds, $97 million. Okay, it's spread across 129 line items in almost every department and school in the medical center and throughout the university. It's not a single source, but it's a pervasive, it's pervasive throughout a university. I have tried in my 16 years here to get other faculty involved here in my research and my projects. Nobody.
Fascinating.
Nobody has taken.
It sounds like a cultural thing in essence, that NIH is gripped by a kind of culture. I'm going to go on to Roberto now, because his presentation I thought was very interesting in highlighting, I would say, different scientific cultures. I mean, culture of genuine inquiry versus a culture of research that's geared towards finding certain outcomes that support certain policies. So, Roberto, you've straddled the divide between physics and the tobacco and nicotine world. Just give us your headline. How do you characterize the difference between what goes on in physics and what goes on in tobacco and nicotine, without being rude about any particular individuals, if you can?
No, there is a confusion because externally they look very similar. You look at the website, for example, Steve Weinberg's Nobel Prize in Physics, and you look at the website of Glantz, and they're very similar. Externally, both of them have PhD students, etc. They go to congresses and so on. So it looks like they are very similar, and also this is a perception that is shared by other scientists. You ask other, it's like the document that I'm circulating in a PDF that is has more detail, but they function very differently in many aspects. For example, in physics, it is very common to disrupt current knowledge. We're trained for that. You're trained to constantly be questioning whether this result is correct and checking it and so on and so on. And physics is always advancing by constant disruption. And there is no plan regarding, the plan is, for example, to solve specific problems, to advance a theory, to fit better observations and facts and so on. And so it's on the way, it's being built on the way. On the other hand, but when we talk about tobacco and nicotine science, there has been an evolution. Tobacco and nicotine science was more or less like physics up to the mid-1990s. It's when the epidemiological research that started in the 1960s that discovered the association between smoking and different diseases. And that was a very, very productive and really scientific endeavor. But then, once tobacco control at the beginning was basically physicians, but then it suddenly became a political movement that acts like a special interest lobby within the US, and this model spread globally. And then there's this issue that then politics took over and science was put in the backseat. Because, you know, science, why? Science is full of contradictions. It goes slowly. The path sometimes is erratic. You never know if you're going to prove or disprove a theory. Things come. And this doesn't work when you want a regulatory policy to be implemented. When you want a regulatory policy to be implemented, you don't want these deviations, these doubts, these queries, and so on. And that's where the difference began. From then onwards, tobacco and nicotine science became more or less a political movement. And this somehow answers the question that you were asking, Brad. Like, who is there that is preventing the adoption of tobacco harm reduction by the NIH, sorry? Who is that? No, what happens is that you have a political movement. Imagine you are Roosevelt and you are trying to implement the New Deal. There is you are not going to tolerate dissent in core issues, because that will delay the implementation of your political plan. And this is the logic of tobacco control after it became, after the tobacco wars, and that it became a political movement. It is guided by a political objective, and that's not the way science works. Science doesn't, at least physics, at least the science that I'm engaged, doesn't work like that.
It's interesting. I suppose a big difference with physics is, you know, what goes on in a black hole or a subatomic particle isn't really directly relevant to normal human experience, whereas, you know, there's no policy on, you know, astrophysics or subatomic particles or gravity or whatever. But here we have people pursuing a political objective. I'm still trying to get at this. Why? Where does this political movement come on, and what are its methods? You know, how does it create incentives for scientists to behave in this way rather than follow good science? And I know I watched Konstantinos very recently posted presentation this morning, which is incredibly moving, actually. You could feel the pain in it. I want to ask him, first of all, how do you actually feel about this as a scientist? What's the subjective experience of being kind of harassed in this way? Very briefly, and then I'd like you also to speculate on the way the incentives for scientists actually work. You know, who are the enforcers and what are their techniques? What role does money play? All of that sort of thing. If you get into some of that, and then we'll go quickly from that into questions. So questions, get ready.
Yeah, in brief, I can say that I feel offended, and that's exactly what I feel, and that's the end of the story. As you can see, I think that the main incentive is money. And money always has the same color. I mean, I think Brad also mentioned that it's all about money, and it's about funding to the universities, funding to research groups. In my case, it's about money coming from philanthropies. And it's not the first time that I've been attacked for my views and my research without criticizing anything in my research. There is no criticism in the content, ever. There is not even a hint that, you know, I manipulated somehow the methodology or the data or the presentation, the interpretation of the results. It's always about supposed and imaginary conflicts. What is particularly concerning is the escalation in this attempt. Until now, it was, some media, newspapers maybe, some groups and organizations which are clearly funded by Bloomberg philanthropies, which were releasing reports and website articles about that. But this has escalated. Now we see scientific journals which not only publish allegations without even trying to confirm and to verify any of these allegations, without even applying a basic rule that, the burden of proof lies on the accuser, not on the accused, but they go even further into depriving from the accused of the right to respond. And that's very concerning. We see articles by journalists which are now registered in the scientific domain. They have a DOI number. They are listed on PubMed. And it's full of nonsense, full of false allegations, and no response is allowed to be published.
Konstantinos, why are they doing this? What's behind this? I'm trying to push this argument. We can see what's happening, but why is it happening? What are they trying to achieve?
I think it's more politics and less science, and that's exactly what it is. Some people are ideologically and dogmatically perceive the issue of tobacco and tobacco harm reduction, because that's what we're talking about. They are causing harm. They are actively causing harm to public health, to millions of smokers. And their agenda and their approach and their strategy is not about doing research. And I think you've mentioned that in your articles too. It's not about doing research. It's not about investigating either misconduct or doing their own research about the purpose, the goals, and the outcome of their own actions. What they are doing is simply trying to discredit anyone who has a different opinion. Okay. Whether they're using true conflicts or imaginary conflicts, it doesn't matter. It's always, however, about conflicts. It's never about the content of the research being published.
All right, let's leave it there. We're going to start opening up to questions other than from me. So, Robin, let's take one from the internet and see if anyone's actually got a good question from our worldwide global audience.
Yes, several good questions. So, from Inga, I think somewhat facetiously, is there such a thing as unbiased science? I think it'd also be interesting to talk a little bit about conflicts of interest that aren't just financial as part of that. Yeah,
I think that's a really good question, actually. What is a conflict of interest? Lynn Kozlowski, see if I can remember the title here, published a brilliant paper on a pandemic of conflicts of interest, in which he basically argued everyone is conflicted in some way, because they come at anybody who's worked in this field has some sort of prior beliefs or prior knowledge which they tend to wish to support, or they've said something in the past which they wish to be consistent with, or they're taking money from a foundation that has a political agenda. Mike Bloomberg, for example, told the New York Times in January 2020 that he favors outright prohibition of e-cigarettes. So if you're an alert grantee on the lookout for funds from that gigantic flow of money, then that's something to bear in mind, isn't it? And not surprisingly, the union, one of the main recipients of Bloomberg money, is in favor of e-cigarette prohibition in low and medium income countries, which covers about 80% of the world's smokers. So let me turn to the panel and get you to reflect on what is a conflict of interest and how should we think about conflicts of interest. And I'm going to ask Brad to go first on this one. Brief answers, if you could, because we've got quite a few to get through, I think. Yeah. We've got quite a few. Let's just have a snappy round of questions now, and then we'll come to the audience here in Liverpool.
Well, as you said, Clive, there are conflicts of interest on all sides, and they do need to be reported. It's as simple as that.
Oh, that was a bit briefer than I was expecting, but that's actually very good.
Well.
Roberto, how does this work does anybody have conflicts of interest in physics? How does it play out in physics?
Well, you mentioned black holes and universe and so on, but that's a type of physics that I work with. But not all physics is like that. Physics is also tied to industry, to technology. So you might work for many physicists are employed in industry, and they develop the type of science that can influence people, and then it can be related to money movements. So sometimes, for example, colleagues of mine ended up working for the US Navy, and so they have to declare that, and whenever they publish a paper, there is a procedure to declare where they are funded, and et cetera, et cetera. So the NASA you can also work for the NASA and so on, so you declare them, but it's not a big issue. Once you declare the conflict of interest, that's a non-issue. We don't care about that. This is one of the most surprising things that for me as an external observer in the field of nicotine and science. That's it.
What if there was two long-standing competing theories of gravity, for example? I don't know if there are, because I don't really know anything about this, but let's say there were. And you constantly find that somebody that supports theory A is finding evidence that supports theory A, and someone who supports theory B is constantly finding evidence that supports theory B. Do people ever say, actually, I need to acknowledge that I've always been in the theory A camp, and therefore expect me to come up with theory A findings? Does that ever happen in physics?
Yeah, it happens that you belong to a certain school of thought, and then you are going to, but since in physics we're used to debating and we're used to intellectual esgrima, then these things are settled down and they are known, and they're not such a big issue. You sometimes know that certain researchers go in certain directions and other, etc. But it is not an existential question that determines the evolution of a given line of research. Yeah, there is politics also in physics, but it works out very differently.
All right, I'm not going to ask every question to every panel member, or we'll be here too long. So, Robin, next question, please. Then we'll get one from the audience.
This one is for Michelle, but I'm sure others will speak on it as well. So, often quip that all the good Puritans came to America. How do you think that affects the drug wars in the past, and how do you think we can move past that, if you think that might be a problem, or soften that moving forward?
Puritans to America, prisoners to Australia. That was the sort of British deal.
I mean, unfortunately, if the Puritans were limited to America, I think the world would be a better place, but they're not, and the influence still, is worldwide. And what you're getting at is this idea that we see in drug policy, in drug research from the beginning up till this day, is that there are a lot of assumptions. Some of those are based in morality, which, in America does stem from Puritanism, but it's all over the Judeo-Christian, European-based world, is this idea that if something is pleasurable, it must be bad. And we're seeing that up to this day, where someone asked in the chat, I saw, why are nicotine replacement therapies, pharmaceutical types of nicotine, not being included in this conversation? Why do they always get a pass? And the reason is because smoking was categorized as immoral. It wasn't just bad for your health, it was immoral. And nicotine replacement therapy is the penance people pay for making an immoral decision. It's not fun. Either you go cold turkey, also not fun, or you use NRTs. Things like vaping or snus, they're pleasurable. And for people who have a moralistic view of what health is and what public health is, find that to be unacceptable. So the Puritans are here, but they are also everywhere. We just happen to be particularly a virulent type.
Michelle, the relationship between adult society and adolescent society? Is that in some way different in the United States? Is adult society more protective of kids, less relaxed about kids engaged in vices than we are in Europe? It kind of feels that way. Or is that manufactured concern that's sort of done for tactical reasons? How deep is the sort of kid thing in the US?
That's a really interesting question, because I think it's a little bit about American culture, but it's also American culture that has been created by media and through previous drug wars, is the myopic focus on and protecting adolescents from any experiences that could potentially reduce their intellectual capacity or their economic capacity. Other cultures, I think, are much more forgiving and accepting of the very normal adolescent process of experimentation and rebellion. But in America, we see, people in this country will spend thousands, many thousands of dollars sending their children to the very, very best preschools because they think that will materially affect their the whole course of their life.
Any questions from the audience here in Liverpool?
The sound is not, I cannot hear you well, Clive.
Oh, okay, hang on. Okay, sound engineer at the back, do something. All right, let's get a question. Oh, okay, thanks. Hello, everyone. Is that better? Is that better, guys? Yeah, great. Okay. Any questions from the audience here in Liverpool? Where am I? Oh, there we go. There we go. Gentleman at the mic. Just give your name and affiliation, if you would.
Yes. Hello, Andre Kuder from Ivapo. I thought I'd say maybe something which is a little bit controversial, but so I'm coming from an independent vaping company. We started in 2014, and I think lots of these independent vaping companies came a bit naive to this whole topic, and we are finding out we are walking a bit of a burned earth in a way. Which kind of where policymakers naturally meet us with a lot of skepticism and mistrust, really, due to the association with tobacco and big tobacco and all the history of that and all the mistrust which has been built on that. And so I mean, would it be an easier conversation in a way if we wouldn't have that kind of association as an industry? Would we find more open doors? Is it maybe, yeah, is that maybe part of the context?
So let me build that into a question to put to the panel, okay? So this field, the world of nicotine, comes burdened with the reputational baggage of the history of smoking, the tobacco industry, and so on. I think what's behind your question is, how does that reputational baggage affect science and the policy discourse in this field, even amongst firms, products, businesses that have never had anything to do with that history and don't make tobacco products in the sense that we understand them outside the United States? Is that a reasonable way of interrogating the panel?
Yes, yeah.
Okay,
so without
let's have some views on that. Konstantinos, you can go first on this. What effect does the presence of the tobacco industry have in this field, and to what extent are things justified or not justified around that?
Listen, I think like that we are seeing a change in the approach. Until now, and understandably so, cigarettes were the evil part of the industry. So the tobacco industry was evil, and understandably so. I mean, it's perfectly justified. But now with the evolution of tobacco harm reduction products, which many of which do not even contain tobacco, like electronic cigarettes, we are turning into calling nicotine evil. And that's what all the companies, including the companies which are not linked at all to the tobacco industry, need to understand. They are going to be part of this evil because they sell nicotine-containing products. Look at our research. Look at how the WHO dismisses research which has nothing to do with smoking. It has nothing to do with e-cigarettes or tobacco harm reduction. It has to do with the possibility, the hypothesis, that pharmaceutical nicotine may have some treatment or even prevention benefits. They don't accept that. They have attacked the French scientific team, which are doing a clinical trial with NRTs, with nicotine patches, just because they're trying nicotine, a pharmaceutical nicotine product, for the treatment of COVID. This is, the whole story starts from the fact that someone suggested that nicotine, it doesn't matter if it's a pharmaceutical form, that nicotine can have benefits in COVID. And you see, nicotine is the evil. And that's what all these companies are facing.
All right, so Brad, what we're seeing is in the past, and this was the sort of, if you like, the golden era of science that Roberto referred to. We had these brilliant scientists like Richard Dole, Richard Pito, and the American equivalent, Ernest Winder, and so on. Basically laid out the smoking and harm case in, using really imaginative studies and brilliant work and so on. And that case has been made. What we're seeing now is, I think as Konstantinos suggested, a shifting of the goalpost towards nicotine. Now, is this a recent development, or was it always there, but sort of an undisclosed objective that we were aiming for the sort of nicotine-free society, and the harm of smoking was essentially a pretext of getting there? Or has it shifted because the new products are all about nicotine and no harm? What's going on there? Brad, if you could go first.
Well, briefly, Clive, this bias has been present since 1981. There's no question about that. When the New England Journal of Medicine published a paper by Deborah Wynn and colleagues about smokeless tobacco and mouth cancer, there is no question that that paper was in large part fraudulent in blaming all forms of smokeless tobacco to cause an epidemic of mouth cancer. So I know from that time on, at least, that all tobacco products were dangerous and all tobacco products were evil. And so now we have a transition from smokeless tobacco, more recently to e-cigarettes. It's the same game plan. It's the same strategy. And to emphasize what Konstantinos said, it's basically now all forms of nicotine.
Okay, so there's a really interesting conflict coming up, and it's going to play out in the United States. I might actually get Robin to reflect on this, but I'm going to start with Michelle. So the Food and Drug Administration's regulation of tobacco has the concept of appropriate for the protection of public health. And if you can satisfy them, that your products are appropriate for the protection of public health, you can put them on the market. WHO, in the guidelines on Article 5.3, has a principle number 1, which is there is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the interests of the tobacco industry and the interests of public health. Now, at first sight, those two principles, those two concepts, clash with each other. So I want to ask Michelle, how's that going to play out in the United States as the Food and Drug Administration starts to issue pre-market tobacco authorizations, and these products come onto the market kind of blessed by FDA, even if they're from big tobacco?
Well, we're already seeing it start to play out, where you had the groups and the politicians who demanded, these novel products be reviewed by and given approval or denied approval by the FDA. And now that the FDA is starting to do that, these groups and lawmakers are turning on the FDA and saying, they're not reliable for this. You can't trust the FDA because the FDA is going to approve things that we don't think should be approved. So, they're the ones turning around now and casting doubt on the scientific institutions they said were necessary in order for these products to be proven safe. It's going to be I think the more relevant aspect of this is how what's going to happen in the US will play out in the rest of the world. Because unlike the US, where people have a significant amount of distrust in all types of government agencies, and much more so in recent years against the health agencies, the rest of the world looks at the FDA with more respect. And I think as the FDA starts approving various e-cigarettes, various heated tobacco products, they've already done it with snus, you will see the conversation is going to get much more difficult in the all forms of tobacco have the same level of harm camp.
Yeah. I'm going to get a comment from Robin, who has had a substantial part of her life wasted by the PMTA process, locked away in dark rooms, typing in things. Robin, it's one thing for the tobacco control organizations like Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and the Bloomberg complex of organizations to sort of put themselves in a fight with the tobacco industry or a few maverick academics that appear to support, like Brad or whatever, who appear to support harm reduction. But it's quite a different thing in American public life if they appear to be in a conflict with the Food and Drug Administration. How do you think it's going to play out when, when we see more of these PMTAs on the market and more e-cigarettes effectively blessed by FDA as positive for public health?
Yeah, so I think in authorizing PMTAs, the politics of it will be pretty complicated. I mean, the last couple of years with the Trump administration, political pressure on the agency hasn't really been perceived well by a lot of the types of groups who've been currently attacking the agency for prospective marketing orders for some of these PMTA products. I think it is an incredibly rigorous scientific process, and these are career scientists and bureaucrats who really care about the process and do protect it from political interference. So I think that they're the best ones capable of making these decisions, and I think seeing Swedish Match and PMI go through the process for their products as well, it's rigorous. They can attest to that, but it's been fair.
I mean, it's a truly awful process, far too burdensome, but that is a major silver lining, is that in the end the FDA endorses these products essentially for appropriate for the protection of public health.
Which is also not permanent, like it's not a forever order. It can be revoked if necessary. So there are a lot of safeguards in place, so it's not perpetual. That's
true. Let's get another question from our internet following, get back to the panel.
All right. A question for Brad. So there is like a big pipeline of researchers in the field being trained up for tobacco and nicotine research, but there probably aren't jobs at academic institutions for all of them, or even for FDA. If they can't get funding from acceptable sources, they need to look for other sources of funding. Is there any way out of this catch-22, or what advice do you have for younger scientists coming up in this field and how to navigate these situations?
No, there's no other real options in tobacco. They'll probably go to pharma or other acceptable sources for funding and or jobs. But keep in mind, as I've said before, there's not enough funding for the scientists that are now at universities. There's tremendous competition within a university and between university faculty for this money. And no, there's never enough funding for all of the trainees. So they'll end up in other fields, but the funding and the publications against harm reduction products will continue into the indefinite future, no doubt.
I mean, it is interesting. There is an astonishing number of people who work in this field, tobacco control, tobacco academia. If you compare it to, say, the number of people who research caffeine or alcohol, it's just off the scale. Every week, dozens of papers, often sometimes with, 10, 15 authors or so on. And if there isn't a huge problem for them to go after, there's nothing for them to do. And I think that's an interesting question, Roberto. I mean, to support that gigantic academic enterprise, you have to have a reason. And are they basically in the business of finding reasons to continue with their academic pursuits and their academic careers and essentially their livelihoods? And are they conflicted because of that?
Clive, keep in mind that all of these researchers have a technique, they have a field, they have a very microscopic specialty, okay? And it's very easy to take what you know and with Microsoft Word, convert it to a tobacco research proposal. It's very simple to do that. They go where the money is. It's the money that drives the research, not the other way around, unfortunately.
But what about the? I mean, the problem is if you come up with a finding that says there's no harm, there's nothing to see here, move on, don't spend any more money with me. That doesn't really happen very often, does it? Why not, Roberto?
It's not publishable.
All right, I'm gonna take a question. Is Neil at the back? Just go to the mic, Neil, if you would, and introduce yourself.
So, Neil McKegney, I wanted to make a small contribution other than from my mobile phone. Although there is a kind of view of science that it's kind of groundbreaking and addressing fundamental questions, much of science actually is pretty orthodox, and it's not surprising therefore that the institution where most science is carried out, universities, are inherently conservative, and I certainly, Brad's experience is my experience too, and almost all of my meetings with senior academics in managing the institution were about how much money could I bring the institution. So it was a very self-serving entity. And I think if that is the case, and orthodoxy predominates within the institutions such as universities, do we have to look to other institutional forms to execute the kind of research which questions those orthodoxies and gives equal voice to new theories, new understandings, challenging knowledge? And if that is the case, what might those different organizational or institutional forms be?
All right, let's get some comments on that from the panel. I'd like to generate, where is the missing challenge here? I mean, there's no doubt in my mind, at least, that a lot of really poor science gets published. Look at it every week, and a lot of it's awful. But most of it goes unremarked. It stays in the journal pages. Very often there's no letters to editors written, and it's cited by people doing future reviews and so on. So where is the missing challenge function? Konstantinos, you've been very, very good at tackling bad science, but why isn't there more of this? And then I'm going to ask Roberto, how does it work in physics? If you put up a ropey paper in physics, what happens, and what happens to you? So let's start with Konstantinos.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that Michelle mentioned the moral approach to this debate. I fully agree with Dr. Professor McKegney, but the issue is, you know, the job of the universities is to challenge the orthodox approach and the common understanding. I don't see who else will be responsible or will be able to challenge the conventional approach. Universities and science, by definition, is about, you know, discussing and challenging what is supposed to be common knowledge, finding new ways, finding new novel understanding on how people, in this case, behave in the case of tobacco use. It's not happening, and that's that's why I'm very pessimistic, because I don't see, if the universities are not doing that, who is going to do that? That's the million-dollar question.
Okay, so but why isn't it happening? In other fields,
because it has become a moral rather than a scientific debate. It's about ethics, which, in my opinion, are simply pseudo-ethics. It's not even real ethics. But so, when you're turning a scientific debate into a political debate, and when all research is guided by predetermined opinions, we must show that tobacco harm reduction and nicotine is bad. And when we apply for funding, you know, the call for proposals is showing how bad something is. I mean, what do you expect the universities to do? They are going to submit proposals discussing about how bad e-cigarettes are, how bad nicotine is. I mean, it's becoming so well organized, and this is coming. I'm not suggesting that someone has, you know, any ill intentions, but it is becoming a moral and political debate rather than a scientific debate, and the universities participate in that.
All right, let's go to Roberto, because you talked eloquently in your presentation about how disruptions play out in physics. Just give us a sense. If somebody comes up with a theory that challenges orthodoxy in physics, what happens, and what should we learn from that, if anything, in the tobacco and nicotine space?
Well, disruptions happen all the time, but they're not major disruptions. And this I would like to, the issue that universities and research and science is orthodox is true, because we cannot be super creative and super disruptive all the time. So there is a sort of routinary type of research that you are simply checking out or fixing little corners here and there. And occasionally you have an idea. And what happens when there is a disruption? Typically in physics, the disruptions don't happen like somebody sitting in a tower and suddenly has a bright idea. The disruptions are brought by observations. I can put a very interesting example. In the case when observations show that the universe is expanding in an accelerated way. That was a disruption. It forced many theories that could have been plausible. They had to be dismissed, and people who had spent years and years and years working on this type of theory, they had to give it up. And so, but this is normal. This is nobody is hurt by that. In fact, we are happy that this type of things happen, right? So but they don't happen all the time. We're not constantly, we're disrupting, but in little steps. In little steps. We cannot be creative all the time. Also, I would like to mention very quickly that science is a corporate activity. There are jobs, promotions, and so sometimes if you don't have tenure, and you are a young researcher or a postdoc or whatever, then sometimes you are not very happy to be so disruptive, because you might not be, you tend to follow the line. Also, on the other hand, researchers that are already too mature and so on, they become too conservative. So there is, typically in physics, we see that there is an age that you are not too young or too old, where you are more disruptive because you want to go up. That's another interesting point. In physics, disruption can be a price. If I, for example, challenge a gravity theory, then I get the attention of everybody. But I must be very good in doing that, because the tests are very difficult. And don't forget that physics is an experimental science. So if your disruption is against the data, then you are out. So you have to be very careful in what you are disrupting. But disruption for us is a prize, it's a privilege, it's something that is very exciting.
Okay.
But there is also a conservative side. That's it.
Same sort of similar tensions, but more enthusiasm for disruption as a basis for scientific curiosity and engagement. Robin,
and prestige also.
And prestige, yeah. This is what I sort of keep coming back to. This is that why isn't it like this? Why isn't the sky full of planes from California heading for Japan to work out what's happening with heated tobacco products? Or why isn't everybody meeting in Sweden all the time to find out why they have the lowest?
Because it's not science, because it's politics.
Okay, that's coming over, but still get this why. Robin, let's have another one from the global audience, please.
Global audience, all right. So it's kind of disappeared a little bit, but what are examples of scientists changing their minds and priors based off of new data? And I think specifically to the panel, what are examples of you personally changing your minds on something that you held?
Okay, that's good. So, how common is this, and when have you ever seen it or done it? Let's just have some quick responses to this, then we'll get one more from the audience here, and then we'll wrap up. So, Michelle, you go first.
Yeah, I was going to go first anyway, whether yes or not. I'd say for me, sugar. So I'm trained as a nutritionist, and the training involves quite a bit of indoctrination and all of this, and I, for a very long time, believed what the common narrative is about when the dietary guidelines were created and how the sugar lobby really threw fat under the bus, and that's why the fat theory became the lipid heart hypothesis idea. If you eat fat or cholesterol, you become fat and you have high cholesterol, and I believe that sugar is this horrible thing. And then as I did some more research, I had to change my mind. I actually pretty much had to apologize to some researchers where I had read into too much of they're dead, but I'm talking about researchers who are operating in the 60s. I had to take a different stance on that. It was difficult. I do see that quite a bit in the research. It's usually subtle, but and I think it should be, you mentioned incentives. That is at the very heart and core of all of the problems we are talking about. And as with physics or physicists, we need to incentivize researchers to question each other, to challenge each other, and give them a prize when they change their mind. That should be seen as the appropriate response in science.
Very good idea. Prizes for changing minds. Very good idea. Prizes for retracting bad papers. I think they should get kudos for that rather than... And
all those scientists who can't get grants, they should go and then form a watchdog organization like Retraction Watch or something like that, where what they do is they just read all the science that comes out and they critique it on its merits, people from all different fields.
Brad, do you want to comment on, on people changing their mind or being persuaded by evidence? Joe Gitchell would always say that almost never happens. No one's ever persuaded by evidence ever. But have you ever seen it?
I've seen it happen with tobacco harm reduction over the past decade, where others, and we now have them as colleagues, on many of the lists and the correspondence is being taken on a daily basis. We now have a contingent that is supporting e-cigarettes, supporting tobacco harm reduction that we didn't have 20 or 30 years ago. So it's happening, but it's happening too slowly to achieve real progress.
Konstantinos, have you ever changed your mind about anything?
Sorry, I was muted, yes. Well, of course I have. Let me say, for example, that initially in late 2011, I had a particularly bad idea and bad opinion about tobacco harm reduction, specifically electronic cigarettes. I thought it was a useless product. This has changed dramatically over time, but this happened after I started doing research on the subject, after meeting e-cigarette users who came as subjects for my research work, and after discussing with them and in an effort to understand why they are using this. So my opinion has changed dramatically, seriously, dramatically. The thing is, why are you changing your opinion? What's the motivation? If the motivation is research that you either perform yourself or that you read in the scientific domain, it's fine. If there are other motives, like financial motives, well, in that case, I think that it doesn't matter who the funding source is, whether it's acceptable, let's call it in quotes, or not.
Right. My experience of people changing their mind, it's mostly through empathy rather than analysis, through a human connection and seeing how other people function rather than analysis, graphs, odds ratios, and all the rest of it. Sood, final question of this session, then we'll wrap up.
Thank you,
Keep it
Clive.
nice and brief, and we'll keep the answers nice and brief. We'll all get lunch on time.
Yep. I'm Sood Patwardhan, Center for Health Research and Education. Question about conflict of interest in terms of what can we learn and how do we look into ourselves as the broader tobacco harm reduction community in terms of addressing some of the concerns raised by the external folks. And I want to just give two examples. One is to compliment Penny over the years on how they, at the beginning of anything they say, they declare their conflict of interest, gets it out of the way. Can this become a habit? Should this become a habit among all researchers in this community so that that doesn't become a problem? And second, kind of linked to researchers having either naively or intentionally a sort of disingenuous way to approach funding. When it comes from an e-cigarette company, which is not tobacco industry owned, it's all right. And then when it is, and there was an instance recently, which I don't want to go in the details of, how does this work when they say themselves and sort of reinforce the negative narrative that, yeah, this was funded by an e-cigarette company before they were acquired by tobacco companies. So this should be good. We shouldn't be doing this, right?
Okay. I don't think there'll be any dispute about the idea of transparency about conflicts and declaring them up front. Your second point was more about whether sort of tobacco company reputation kind of contaminates the discourse of e-cigarette companies, and has anybody got a view on that? Has anybody feel, you know, I mean, I remember saying, I remember my own thoughts on this, saying, you know, there was a kind of purity argument from e-cigarette companies in which they said, well, we're nothing to do with the tobacco industry. And I felt, well, what happens if you get taken over or bought out? You know, you're exactly the same people doing exactly the same things, but you're just owned by someone else. How much does that matter? And something quite similar to that happened to Juul. So how does that change anything? Does anybody want to give me a last comment on this?
Want me to?
Yeah,
Why not Robin, since she actually is a consultant to Juul?
Yeah, I think that that conflict is definitely something that makes it harder to publish, and people perceive you as being part of the industry. I think ultimately what's important, though, at least in the US, is that there is, all of the regulations require that all data is submitted to the FDA, so they run their own analyses, and it's an incredibly rigorous standard. So they have, you know, it's forced transparency where the regulator has access to everything. So you don't have to trust the company, you have to trust the process and the regulators.
That is a good thing about the US system. Folks, we're going to wrap it up there. I want to thank, no, sorry, Roberto, we're done. People here need their lunch, you need your breakfast. So thank you to Roberto, to Konstantinos, to Michelle, to Brad, and to Robin, and thanks to everyone here and worldwide for the great questions. This session is over. Thanks very much.